A gentle hum filled the air inside a well-lit jewelry store in Portland, Maine. Gleaming cases lined the walls, showcasing rings, necklaces, and gems that shimmered under the soft glow of strategically placed lights. Each piece seemed to hold a story, a whisper of elegance waiting to adorn someone's life. At the entrance, Ruth stepped in, adjusting her worn leather purse on her shoulder. She was in her late 70s, her silver curls tucked neatly beneath a beret. She looked around with a familiar smile, her dark eyes taking in the displays she'd seen countless times before. Ruth's son, Eric, had poured his heart into this store, turning it into one of the most admired spots in town. She felt a surge of pride each time she stepped inside, knowing her boy had built this success from the ground up. Today, Ruth had come to surprise Eric. It was a routine of theirs. Every few weeks, she'd drop by unannounced, bringing him lunch from his favorite cafe. She had a soft spot for these visits, watching him interact with clients, seeing him in his element. But today, Eric was out. A brief message from the clerk at the front desk explained he'd stepped away for a meeting with a new supplier and would be back shortly. The next moments unfolded in a blur. Ruth barely registered the sound of the front door swinging open or the quick, heavy steps of two police officers entering the store. Both men were tall, their uniforms crisp, and their expressions unreadable. They walked directly toward the saleswoman, who immediately launched into a theatrical recounting of events. This woman, the saleswoman declared, pointing an accusatory finger at Ruth, was caught red-handed trying to steal this earring. I had to stop her before she fled. Ruth's hands shook as she tried to speak. I wasn't trying to steal anything, she said, her voice wavering. It was an accident. Please, I'm the owner's mother. The officers exchanged a glance, but their attention remained on the saleswoman. One of them turned to Ruth, his gaze hard and impersonal. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step forward. Ruth took a step closer, her knees weak. Please, this is a mistake, she said, but her voice was barely above a whisper. Before she could say another word, the officer grabbed her arm, pulling her roughly to the side. The sudden force made her stumble, and she winced as they twisted her hands behind her back. What are you doing? Ruth cried out, panic flooding her voice. The cold metal of handcuffs clamped around her wrists, and the sound was deafening. Ruth stood frozen, too shocked to move. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked around the store, searching for a friendly face, for anyone who might help. But there was no one, just the saleswoman watching with a triumphant smirk. I didn't steal anything, Ruth said, her voice cracking as tears began to spill down her cheeks. You're making a mistake. One of the officers spoke in a flat, emotionless tone. You can explain yourself down at the station. The words hit her like a blow, knocking the air out of her lungs. Down at the station. Ruth had lived a long life, faced her share of challenges, but never, not once, had she ever been treated like this. The humiliation was unbearable. She felt like a criminal, though she'd done nothing wrong. The officers began leading her toward the door, their grip firm and unyielding. Ruth's mind raced, each thought more desperate than the last. She didn't understand how this could be happening. This was her son's store, a place that had always felt safe. How had it become a nightmare? As they reached the threshold, a voice boomed from across the room. What the hell is going on here? The officers paused, and Ruth turned her head toward the source of the voice. Her heart leapt as she saw Eric standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of confusion and fury. Eric stood frozen for only a moment before striding forward, his presence commanding attention. His tailored suit, standard for meetings with suppliers, was slightly wrinkled as though he had rushed back. His jaw was tight, his movements quick and deliberate as he took in the scene, his mother handcuffed and tearful, the officers holding her arms, and the saleswoman standing smugly to the side. Take those off her, Eric ordered, his voice low but charged with barely restrained anger. One officer cleared his throat, shifting uneasily. Sir, we were responding to a theft complaint. Take them off, Eric repeated, each word clipped and precise. His dark eyes burned as he stepped closer, his focus shifting to his mother. Are you okay, Mom? His tone softened slightly, but his hands balled into fists at his sides. Ruth nodded weakly, her voice trembling. I didn't do anything, Eric. I just dropped an earring. Eric turned to the saleswoman, his expression icy. Miss Turner, care to explain why you thought calling the police on my mother was a good idea? Miss Turner faltered for a moment, clearly caught off guard. Sir, I didn't know she was your mother. She dropped the earring, and it looked like, well, I thought she was trying to. You thought? Eric snapped, his voice rising slightly. What gave you the right to assume my mother, of all people, was a thief? I didn't mean, Miss Turner stammered, her confidence crumbling. I was just trying to protect the store. Eric let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Protect the store from my own mother? Do you have any idea what you've done? You didn't just insult her. You insulted me, this business, and everything we stand for. He gestured toward Ruth, who was still trembling. Look at her. Does she look like a thief to you? Miss Turner's mouth opened and closed as she struggled for a response, but no words came. Eric turned to the officers, who had yet to remove the handcuffs. Are you seriously just standing there? He demanded. Do you even have any evidence she was stealing, or did you just take this woman's word for it? The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances before one of them finally stepped forward and removed the cuffs. As soon as Ruth's hands were free, Eric was by her side, rubbing her wrists gently. I'm so sorry, Mom, he said softly. You shouldn't have gone through that. Ruth shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand how it got this far. Eric straightened, his anger surging once more as he addressed the room. This ends now, he said firmly, his gaze locked onto Miss Turner. You're fired. I don't need people like you representing my business. Miss Turner's face turned ashen. Sir, please, I didn't know. I don't care, Eric interrupted, his tone cold and final. Get out. Now. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her belongings, avoiding everyone's eyes as she hurried out the door. Eric turned to the officers next. And you two, you owe my mother an apology. She's been humiliated enough for one day. One officer cleared his throat awkwardly. We were following protocol based on the complaint. Protocol? Eric shot back, his voice dripping with disbelief. Your protocol is to slap handcuffs on an elderly woman without investigating the truth? That's what you call protecting and serving? The officers stood silent, their earlier confidence evaporating. Finally, one mumbled, We're sorry, ma'am. Ruth looked at them, her expression unreadable. She simply nodded before Eric ushered her to a chair near the counter. Sit down, Mom, Eric said gently, his hand on her shoulder. I'll take care of everything. As Ruth sank into the seat, Eric turned back to the officers. You can leave now. I'll be filing a formal complaint about how this was handled. The officers hesitated before nodding slightly and heading for the door, their departure marked by an awkward silence. Eric knelt beside Ruth, his voice softening. You okay? Do you need anything? Ruth shook her head, her hand resting over his. I just want to go home. Eric exhaled, a mix of relief and lingering frustration washing over him. We'll go soon. But first, I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again. The days that followed were a whirlwind of phone calls, statements, and legal proceedings. Eric wasted no time filing an official complaint against the officers and pressing charges against Miss Turner for assaulting his mother. Ruth, though shaken, supported her son's decision. She knew this wasn't just about her, it was about preventing anyone else from enduring the same humiliation. The news spread quickly. Golden Grace Jewelers, once known for its elegant reputation, was now at the center of a heated conversation about prejudice and accountability. Customers voiced their support for Eric's actions, though a few questioned the decision to fire Miss Turner so publicly. Eric was unyielding. There's no room for that kind of behavior in my business, he told a local reporter. And there shouldn't be room for it anywhere. Meanwhile, Miss Turner was facing her own reckoning. Video footage from the store's security cameras left no doubt about what had occurred. The recording captured her aggression, the slap, and her blatant refusal to listen to Ruth's explanations. It also revealed the officer's rough treatment of Ruth, further fueling outrage.
In court, Miss Turner appeared visibly shaken.
Gone was the confident, cold demeanor she'd shown in the store. She now looked small and fragile, her hands trembling as she sat at the defense table. The prosecutor laid out the evidence methodically, using the footage and witness testimonies to paint a clear picture of her actions. Ruth, at Eric's insistence, did not have to testify.
He knew reliving the experience in front of strangers would be too much for her.
Instead, the prosecutor relied on the video and statements from the police officers, who admitted they had acted too quickly. Their admission was a small victory, but it didn't erase the pain they had caused. As the trial progressed, Ruth began to feel a strange mix of emotions. She was grateful for the support she'd received from Eric and the community, but the incident had left a mark on her that no verdict could erase. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still feel the sting of the slap, hear the clink of the handcuffs, and see the disapproving glares from people who didn't even know her. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. Miss Turner was convicted of assault and defamation, and the judge handed down a sentence that included community service and mandatory sensitivity training.
Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Eric and Ruth.
Eric spoke confidently, his words carrying the weight of someone determined to make a difference. "This isn't just about what happened to my mother," he said. "It's about ensuring no one else has to face this kind of treatment. Discrimination has no place in our society, and it's up to all of us to fight against it." Ruth, standing beside him, spoke more softly but with equal conviction. "I've lived a long life," she said, her voice steady despite the crowd, "and I've seen too much of this.
But I believe in my son, and I believe we can do better. We have to."
The crowd murmured in agreement as cameras flashed, capturing a moment that felt both personal and universal. Ruth's resilience and Eric's determination had turned a moment of injustice into a call for change. The days after the verdict brought a sense of closure but also reflection. For Ruth, the ordeal left scars, but it also strengthened her resolve. Eric, ever the protector, made sure his mother was surrounded by love and support.
Friends and family visited often, bringing warmth and laughter back into their lives. Golden Grace Jewelers also underwent significant changes.
Eric implemented new training programs for his staff, focusing on fairness and cultural sensitivity. He invited community leaders to hold workshops, ensuring his business became a place where everyone felt respected and welcome. The store's reputation began to recover, bolstered by Eric's transparency and dedication to making things right. For Ruth, life slowly returned to a new normal. She resumed her weekly visits to the store, though now she was greeted with even more warmth by staff and customers alike. The incident had changed her, but it hadn't broken her. If anything, it made her stronger. One afternoon, as Ruth sat in her son's office sipping tea, she looked at Eric with pride. "You've done well," she said softly, "not just with the store but with standing up for what's right." Eric smiled, his hand resting on hers. "I had a good example to follow," he said.
"You taught me everything I know about resilience."
Outside the store, the community had rallied together, inspired by the story. Discussions about prejudice and accountability became more frequent, not just in Portland but in neighboring towns. Ruth and Eric's story was shared widely, sparking conversations that reached far beyond their small city. As Ruth prepared to leave the store that day, Eric walked her to the door. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the street. Ruth paused, taking in the view, and then looked back at her son. "I know this wasn't easy," she said, "but you turned something awful into something meaningful. That's how change happens."
Eric nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "And it's not over. There's still so much to do."
Ruth smiled, her heart filled with a quiet sense of hope.
"One step at a time, son."
As she walked away, the bell above the door chimed softly, a sound that had once been routine but now felt like a reminder of resilience and progress. Ruth knew the world wasn't perfect, but she also knew change was possible, one step, one story, one act of courage at a time.
Ruth didn't mind.
She could easily spend time browsing the displays, letting her thoughts wander. As she walked down the aisles, her fingers lightly brushed the glass cases, feeling a warmth that only came from years of familiarity. Her eyes drifted to a particular set of diamond earrings. They reminded her of a pair she'd once owned many years ago, long before the hardships, before life's demands forced her to sell them.
For a moment, a flicker of nostalgia washed over her.
Lost in thought, Ruth leaned closer to get a better look at the earrings, captivated by their sparkle. She moved just slightly, her fingers resting against the glass. But then, a small slip, her fingers brushed against the edge of the stand, and one of the earrings tipped over, falling to the floor with a quiet clink.
Ruth's heart skipped a beat.
She bent down slowly, careful with her movements, feeling a touch of embarrassment for causing a scene, even if no one had seemed to notice. As she reached out to pick up the earring, a pair of sharp heels clicked against the floor behind her. Ruth looked up, blinking, as a tall, stern-faced saleswoman stood over her. The woman, who Ruth didn't recognize, must have been new to the store. Her expression was unreadable, yet Ruth sensed a chill in her gaze. There was no warmth, no trace of the familiar friendliness she'd grown accustomed to in this place her son owned. But Ruth brushed it off, trying to explain as she rose to her feet.
"I'm so sorry, dear. I just wanted a closer look. This earring reminds me of a pair I once."
But the woman didn't give her a chance to finish. With a glare that pierced through Ruth, the saleswoman crossed her arms, looking her over with an expression that held more than just disapproval. The saleswoman's voice was sharp and cold, cutting through the air like glass. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing as she stared at Ruth. Ruth, taken aback, straightened herself and held up the earring delicately. "I accidentally knocked it over," she began, her voice steady but soft.
"I was just admiring it, Anne."
"Admiring it," the saleswoman interrupted, her tone dripping with disdain.
"You mean pocketing it, don't you?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and stifling.
Ruth's breath caught in her throat.
"Pocketing it?
That's absurd.
I've never." But the woman wasn't listening.
Her eyes swept over Ruth, taking in her modest coat and weathered purse, and something cruel flickered in her expression. "People like you don't belong in stores like this," she hissed. Her words were quiet but venomous, laced with an unspoken prejudice that Ruth felt cut into her like a blade. Ruth's hand trembled as she held out the earring, her voice faltering.
"I think there's been some misunderstanding."
The saleswoman stepped closer, snatching the earring from Ruth's hand with a force that startled her. "Save your excuses," she snapped.
"I'm calling the police."
Ruth's heart pounded in her chest. The sheer absurdity of the situation made her head spin.
"The police? That's not necessary," she pleaded. "I didn't do anything wrong."
Ignoring her protests, the saleswoman pulled out her phone and began dialing, her voice turning unervingly composed as she spoke to the dispatcher.
"Yes, I need officers at Golden Grace Jewelers. We've caught someone trying to steal a diamond earring."
"She's still here, and I've detained her."
"Detained?"
Ruth whispered to herself in disbelief. She took a step back, clutching the strap of her purse as if it might ground her in the chaos swirling around her.
The story of Ruth and Eric didn't just fade away after the trial and its aftermath.
Instead, it became a powerful narrative of resilience and the importance of addressing prejudice. Ruth found herself approached by people she'd never met, sharing their own stories of facing discrimination.
Many expressed gratitude for her and Eric's courage in standing up for what was right. Eric's business, Golden Grace Jewelers, flourished in new ways.
While some predicted the negative publicity might tarnish its reputation, the opposite happened.
Customers admired Eric's firm stance against prejudice and his swift action to create a more inclusive environment.
People felt reassured knowing that the store was a place where fairness and respect mattered. The changes Eric implemented extended beyond the store. He partnered with local advocacy groups to promote anti-discrimination training across other businesses in Portland. Workshops were held to teach employees how to recognize and combat biases, ensuring a more equitable experience for everyone. The effort garnered attention, and Eric was soon invited to speak at community events, sharing how his personal experiences had shaped his outlook on justice and responsibility. For Ruth, life regained a comforting rhythm. Though the incident had left its scars, she refused to let it define her. She found solace in the small joys of her daily routine, tending to her garden, catching up with friends, and spending time with her grandchildren. Her resilience became a source of inspiration not only to her family but to the broader community. One day, as Ruth was tending to her roses, Eric stopped by for a visit. He carried a small velvet box in his hand. "I have something for you, Mom," he said, a playful smile on his face. Curious, Ruth set aside her gardening tools and opened the box. Inside was a pair of diamond earrings, strikingly similar to the ones that had sparked the ordeal in the store. Her eyes filled with tears as she carefully lifted one of the earrings, its facets catching the sunlight. "Eric, they're beautiful," she whispered. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," Eric replied. "After everything you've been through, I thought it was time to replace the pair you lost all those years ago. You deserve something that makes you smile." Ruth embraced her son tightly, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You've always been such a good son." As the weeks turned into months, Ruth found herself reflecting often on the incident and its aftermath. She realized how much it had changed not just her life, but the lives of others. The story had sparked conversations about prejudice and accountability, and she took comfort in knowing that her experience had made a difference. Eric continued to expand his advocacy efforts, creating a foundation to provide resources and support for individuals who had experienced discrimination. He named the foundation after Ruth, honoring her strength and resilience. The Ruth Coleman Foundation quickly became a symbol of hope, offering counseling services, legal aid, and workshops on diversity and inclusion. Ruth, though initially hesitant, agreed to become an ambassador for the foundation. She attended events, shared her story, and met with others who had faced similar challenges. The work gave her a renewed sense of purpose and reminded her that it was never too late to make a difference. One evening, as Ruth and Eric sat together on her porch, watching the sunset, Ruth turned to her son. "You've done so much good, Eric. I'm proud of you." Eric smiled warmly. "It's because of you, Mom. You taught me to stand up for what's right, no matter how difficult it is." Ruth reached for his hand, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And you've shown me that even the hardest moments can lead to something beautiful." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ruth felt a profound sense of peace. She knew that life would always have its challenges, but she also knew that courage, kindness, and determination could create change. Together, she and Eric had turned a moment of injustice into a legacy of hope and progress, a legacy that would continue to inspire others for years to come. The Ruth Coleman Foundation grew beyond what either Ruth or Eric could have imagined. Stories poured in from across the country, stories of people who had faced discrimination and found the courage to speak out because of Ruth's example. Schools and businesses invited Ruth and Eric to share their journey, and their message resonated deeply with audiences of all ages. Ruth, who had always lived a quiet life, found herself standing before packed rooms, sharing her story with a steady voice and a kind smile. "It's not easy to confront prejudice," she would say, "but it's necessary. Silence only lets it grow. Speaking up, even when it's hard, is how we move forward." At first, Ruth was nervous about her new role, but with Eric by her side, she grew into it. She realized that her experience had given her the power to help others, and she embraced the opportunity. Over time, she saw the profound impact her words could have. People approached her after events, some with tears in their eyes, thanking her for helping them feel seen and heard. Eric, meanwhile, balanced his time between running Golden Grace Jewelers and expanding the foundation's reach. The store became more than just a business, it was a hub for community engagement. Eric started hosting monthly events at the store, bringing people together to discuss topics like fairness, empathy, and the importance of standing against injustice. The events were well attended, and the store's atmosphere reflected the warmth and inclusivity Eric had worked so hard to cultivate. One day, a young woman named Elena walked into Golden Grace Jewelers. She introduced herself as someone who had seen Ruth speak at a foundation event. "Your story changed my life," she said, her voice trembling. "I was in a job where I was constantly overlooked because of who I am. But hearing you speak gave me the courage to stand up for myself. I left that job, and now I'm in a place where I'm respected and valued." Ruth smiled warmly and reached out to hold Elena's hand. "That means more to me than you'll ever know," she said. "You're the reason I do this."
Moments like these reminded Ruth and Eric that their efforts were making a real difference. The foundation's programs grew to include scholarships for students pursuing careers in social justice, grants for small businesses that prioritized diversity and inclusion, and workshops aimed at teaching empathy and understanding in workplaces and schools. The work wasn't without challenges. Ruth and Eric faced criticism from those who felt they were overreacting to what some considered an isolated incident. But they stood firm in their mission, knowing that the fight against prejudice was far from over. Ruth often said, "It's not about one incident, it's about a pattern that needs to change. If we don't address it, who will?" As the years passed, Ruth watched with pride as Eric continued to thrive. Golden Grace Jewelers became a model for other businesses, and the Ruth Coleman Foundation gained national recognition. But for Ruth, the most important part of her journey was the connections she made with people. Every story shared, every life touched, reaffirmed her belief that change was possible. On her 80th birthday, Ruth was surprised with a celebration at the store. Friends, family, and members of the community gathered to honor her. Eric stood before the crowd, a microphone in hand, and spoke with deep emotion. "My mother has always been my greatest inspiration," he said. "Her strength, her kindness, and her unwavering sense of justice have shaped who I am. Today, we celebrate not just her birthday, but the countless lives she's touched and the change she's inspired." Ruth wiped away tears as she looked around the room, seeing the faces of people she had come to know and care about. She stood to address the crowd, her voice steady but full of feeling. "I never imagined that my life would take this path," she said. "But I'm grateful for it. Together, we've shown that even in the face of hardship, we can create something beautiful. And that's a lesson I'll carry with me always." As the evening drew to a close, Ruth sat with Eric, watching the celebration around them. She leaned over and said softly, "You've given me so much to be proud of, Eric." "Thank you." Eric smiled and took her hand. "It's all because of you, Mom. You taught me to be brave." Ruth nodded, her heart full. She knew that their work was far from done, but she also knew they had laid a strong foundation for the future. As the lights of the store sparkled around them, Ruth felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that she and Eric had made a lasting difference, one step, one story, one act of courage at a time. As the Ruth Coleman Foundation continued to grow, its impact extended well beyond Portland, Maine. Ruth and Eric's story became a beacon of hope for communities across the nation. Schools and organizations began to adopt their message of resilience and justice, incorporating their materials into training programs and educational curricula. One particularly memorable moment came when a national network featured a documentary about Ruth's journey. Titled One Step at a Time, the film chronicled the events that had transpired at Golden Grace Jewelers, the legal battle that followed, and the transformative work of the foundation. Interviews with Ruth, Eric, and individuals whose lives had been changed by their advocacy brought the story to life. The documentary was met with critical acclaim and sparked widespread discussions about prejudice, accountability, and the power of personal courage. Ruth, who had always been modest about her role, found herself being recognized in public more often. At first, it felt strange to her, but she grew to embrace it as an opportunity to connect with others. Whether it was a stranger in a grocery store or a young person seeking advice at a foundation event, Ruth listened with patience and compassion, offering words of encouragement drawn from her own experiences. One day, a letter arrived at Ruth's home. It was from a woman named Lila, who lived in a small town in the Midwest. Lila wrote about her struggles as a single mother facing workplace discrimination and how hearing Ruth's story had given her the strength to fight for her rights. She ended the letter by saying, "Your courage reminded me that I deserve to be treated with dignity. Thank you for showing me that standing up for myself is worth it." Ruth read the letter several times, her heart swelling with emotion. She shared it with Eric, who smiled warmly. "You've changed so many lives, Mom," he said. "And you're still doing it, one person at a time." Despite her growing influence, Ruth remained deeply rooted in her community. She continued to spend time at Golden Grace Jewelers, now a thriving example of inclusivity and respect. She enjoyed her weekly visits, chatting with staff and customers, and often helping Eric brainstorm new ways to expand their mission. One afternoon, during a quiet moment in the store, Ruth and Eric sat together in his office. Eric leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I've been thinking," he began. "What if we open more stores? Not just for the business, but as a way to spread our values even further. Each one could be a place where people feel welcome and respected, no matter who they are." Ruth's eyes lit up. "That's a wonderful idea, Eric. It's not just about selling jewelry. It's about creating spaces where people feel valued." Over the next few years, Eric's vision became a reality. New locations of Golden Grace Jewelers opened in cities across the country, each one embodying the principles of fairness and inclusion that had become the company's hallmark. The stores hosted community events, supported local causes, and partnered with the Ruth Coleman Foundation to provide resources and education. Meanwhile, the foundation itself expanded its reach, launching initiatives to address systemic inequalities in housing, education, and employment. Ruth and Eric worked closely with activists, educators, and policymakers to ensure their programs made a lasting impact. As Ruth approached her mid-80s, she began to take a step back from the foundation's day-to-day activities, trusting Eric and a dedicated team to carry the mission forward. She spent more time with her family, cherishing moments with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But even in her quieter years, Ruth remained a source of wisdom and inspiration. One evening, as Ruth sat on her porch watching the stars, Eric joined her, a cup of tea in hand. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Eric spoke. "Mom, do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked. "Sometimes it feels like a dream." Ruth smiled, her gaze still fixed on the sky. "I think about it all the time," she said. "And I'm proud of what we've done. But more than that, I'm proud of the way you've carried on the work. You've turned something painful into something beautiful." Eric reached for her hand, his voice filled with gratitude. "None of this would have been possible without you. You've always been the heart of it all." Ruth's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "And you've always been my strength. Together, we've shown that even in the face of adversity, there's hope. That's what matters most." As the night deepened, Ruth felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She knew the journey had not been easy, but it had been worth every step. Her story and Eric's determination to honor it had created a ripple effect of kindness and justice that would continue to grow long after she was gone. Ruth closed her eyes, listening to the gentle rustle of the wind and the steady rhythm of her son's breathing beside her. She felt at peace, knowing that her legacy was in good hands, and that the work they had started together would live on, one act of courage at a time. As the years passed, Ruth's legacy deepened, leaving an indelible mark on her community and far beyond. Eric continued to lead both Golden Grace Jewelers and the Ruth Coleman Foundation with unwavering dedication. His vision evolved, introducing mentorship programs for young entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities. These initiatives empowered countless individuals to pursue their dreams, just as Eric had with Ruth's unwavering support. One day, during a gala held in honor of the foundation's 10th anniversary, Eric took the stage to reflect on their journey. The room was filled with supporters, activists, and beneficiaries of the foundation's work. Eric's voice was steady, but his emotions were palpable. "I often think about that day in the store," he began. "What started as an act of injustice could have left us broken. But instead, it sparked something greater. My mother's strength, her dignity, and her refusal to let prejudice define her inspired me to act, and that action has brought all of us here tonight." The audience applauded warmly, and Eric continued. "This foundation is a testament to her courage and the belief that change is possible when we stand together. My mother taught me that it's not enough to wish for a better world, we have to work for it, step by step." As he finished his speech, the crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Ruth, seated at the front table with her family, felt a deep sense of pride. Though age had slowed her, her spirit remained as strong as ever. She exchanged a smile with Eric, her heart full. Following the gala, Ruth and Eric took a quiet moment together in the foundation's office. The walls were adorned with photos and mementos from their journey, a visual testament to the lives they had touched. "Do you ever imagine what Dad would think if he were here?" Eric asked, his voice soft. Ruth's eyes glistened as she thought of her late husband. "He'd be proud of you, Eric. He always believed in you, and he'd be amazed at what you've accomplished."
Eric smiled, looking at a photo of Ruth and his father that hung on the wall. "I hope I've made both of you proud." "You have," Ruth said firmly. "In more ways than I can count." Over the following months, Ruth began to retreat further into her home, content to spend her days surrounded by family and close friends. Her health was declining, but she faced it with the same grace and strength she had always shown. Eric visited daily, often bringing his children and grandchildren, who loved listening to Ruth's stories about her life. One sunny afternoon, Ruth sat in her garden, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air. Eric joined her, helping her settle into a comfortable chair beneath the shade of a tree. "Mom," Eric began, his voice hesitant, "I've been thinking about starting something new, a scholarship program in your name. It would be for young people who show the kind of resilience and courage you've always embodied." Ruth reached out to take his hand, her grip still surprisingly strong. "That sounds wonderful," she said. "Helping others find their way is the best legacy we can leave." In the weeks that followed, Eric made Ruth's scholarship program a reality. The Ruth Coleman Resilience Scholarship was launched, offering financial support and mentorship to students who had overcome significant challenges in their lives. The first round of recipients shared their stories during an emotional ceremony, each one expressing gratitude for Ruth's example. Ruth's health continued to decline, and one quiet evening, surrounded by her family, she passed away peacefully in her sleep. The news of her passing spread quickly, and tributes poured in from across the nation. Ruth's funeral was attended by hundreds, a testament to the lives she had touched. Eric delivered the eulogy, his voice steady despite his grief. "My mother was a beacon of light in a world that can sometimes feel dark," he said. "She taught us that courage and kindness can overcome even the greatest challenges. Her legacy is not just in the work we've done, but in the hearts of everyone she inspired. She may no longer be with us, but her spirit will guide us forever." In the months following Ruth's passing, Eric poured himself into the foundation and the store, ensuring that his mother's legacy continued to grow. Golden Grace Jewelers became a symbol of Ruth's values, and the foundation expanded its programs to address new challenges in education, equality, and community building. Every year on Ruth's birthday, the foundation held a celebration of her life, inviting speakers to share stories of resilience and change. The event became a cherished tradition, drawing people from all walks of life who had been inspired by Ruth's journey. Eric often reflected on his mother's wisdom and strength as he carried the torch of her legacy. "She taught me everything I know about resilience," he would say. "And now, it's my job to pass that lesson on." Ruth's story continued to ripple outward, touching countless lives and reminding the world that even in the face of injustice, one person's courage can spark lasting change. One step, one story, one act of courage at a time.